we are learn about the application layer part 2. In this lecture, we have to learn the domain name system DNS and the DNS server. These two topics is a name of application layer using a DNS. Here in a domain name system, DNS is the meaning of the internet is a vast ocean where the information is available in the form of millions of the website. The information is available. Internet information is available millions of the website, and each website is stored on a server. Each website is stored on a server which is connected to the internet, which means each server has an IP address. Each server has an IP address. This IP address you have to including the information available in the form of millions of the website, and each website you can store the data through the internet. Every device connected to the internet has an IP address. To access a website or the IP address you can use for the IP version 6 or IP version 4. It is used on a different website. It is very difficult to remember the IP address, but you have to different website as they are in the terms of number or the strings. It is a difficult, remember to difficult the IP address, but it is a system you have to the term or the numbers and the strings you can use for the IP address. However, it is easier to remember names, and therefore each computer server hosting a website or the web resource is given name against its IP address. These names are called as domains name. The IP address is very difficult remembering the different websites, but it is easier to remember names, and therefore each computer you can use a server hosting, and the web server is given name against its IP address, and this is known as the domain name or the host name. It is a unique IP address assigned to each server. For easy understanding, it can be considered phone book where instead of remembering and each person phone number, we have assigned the number of their numbers. It is an domain name system. You can use a server or the unique IP address assigned to each server, and this is unique address you can use for the considering of the phone book or the instead of remembering each person of the phone number. In the next slide, you can most important the examples of domain name and their map IP addresses. Here the domain name first MHRD government.in, and this is the domain name is using a hosting of the government MHRD Maharashtra government, and here the IP address. This is IP address 164.100.163.45. It is the IP address you have to use a 4 IP addresses 4 version. This is the version 1, 2, 3 and the 4. 4 versions there are two domain name you can using for the wikipedia.org, and the second one you have to use for the government.in, MHRD government.in. This is best examples. You have to use a hosting of the domain or other their map of the IP address. Then this address you have to use a domain name in the form of the examples and their map IP addresses. Here in this slide you can see their DNS server, how to use a DNS server in the form of the hosting. Instead of remembering IP addresses, we assign a domain name and to each IP address to access a web server. A web server needs to find out the IP address it is corresponding to the domain name is entered. Conversion of the domain name, each web server is to correspond the IP address, and this is called as the domain name resolution. In a domain name resolution, it is done through a server is called as DNS server, and thus is you can use for entire URL. What is mean by URL? Uniform resource locator, and that locator you have to use a web browser using the HTTP protocol. It approaches the computer server and called as DNS server to maintain the IP address correspond to that domain name. After getting the IP address, HTTP protocol it retrieves the information and it's load into our browser. Take an example here is shown in HTTP request or DNS servers. Here saying the HTTP request. What is the HTTP hypertext transfer protocol? Here the user use the HTTP protocol and send the 4 version of 162.100.163.45, and this is the HTTP address you have to send the DNS server, and this is a server sends back to the IP address. In DNS server it's maintain the database. In this slide you can see the DNS server maintain the database and its domain name or their corresponding IP address. To understand how the domain name resolution works, we have to understand and where the DNS servers are kept. The DNS servers are placed in hierarchical order at the top level, and the 13 servers is called as the root server. There are 13 servers you have to use for the top level in a domain name system, and that server to maintain a database, and it is a top level root server. It's then below the root server there are other DNS servers at a different level, and the DNS server may contain the IP address it's correspond to the domain. It will contain the IP address or other DNS servers. It is known as the DNS server using a application layer, and this is most important protocols you have to use for the application layer in the form of the domain. Also, it is used as a hosting of the computers and the servers. The domain name servers you have to use two basic inputs corresponding HTTP and the DNS server using a URL. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye. Have a nice day.